Welcome to the Beyond Atheism podcast, with me, Nathan Alexander, and my co-host, Todd Tavares. This podcast moves beyond questions of God's existence to ask, what's next in a godless world? Beyond Atheism is produced and distributed by Atheists United Studios.
Elliot Hanowski is an academic librarian and historian based in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada. He has a PhD from Queen's University. His dissertation research formed the basis for his new book on the history of atheism in Canada called Towards a Godless Dominion, Unbelief in Interwar Canada. Elliot, welcome to Beyond Atheism.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, great to have you.
Yeah, thanks, Elliot, for coming on. We really enjoyed the book and looking forward to talking with you about it. But before we get into kind of the contents of the book, we wanted to ask a little bit about your own religious background, if we could.
Sure. Well, I was raised as one of Jehovah's Witnesses, and so I was part of that community for, the first 21 or 22 years of my life. And then around age 22 or so, I kind of went through a crisis and ended up leaving because there was a lot about it that I couldn't accept anymore. And so I tried to make kind of a mainstream Christianity work for a while. I attended an Anglican church for about 5 years, but then I couldn't make that work either. So I ended up becoming an agnostic, and that's what I am today.
And how did that inform how you chose this topic as a historian?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, they say that your dissertation is always partially autobiographical. And so, I mean, I think, my own history of, working my way through arguments for and against religion definitely influenced my interest. And so I found, this topic about interwar atheism in Canada to be quite interesting in a way that, I don't know. I've noticed in speaking to undergraduates, for example, is that like many Canadians, especially younger Canadians, have no interest either for or against religion. It's just kind of a dead topic to them. Whereas I guess for me, it had been a live topic. So I still found the discussions about it interesting as opposed to just kind of like, who cares, right?
Yeah. Oh, I'm going to have to bring it. Now that you mention the autobiographical nature of it, now it changes how I feel about a lot of the questions I had prepared, because it's one of the things that's very striking about it is just how different things were in the interwar period. It's a very different time, and certainly like sociologically, right? So can you take us back there? Do we know how religious the Canadian population is in 1920? Do they have records of this? Do they know how many people are actually atheists?
Yeah. I mean, I talk a bit about some of the numbers in the book. It's hard to say, right, to some degree, because Christianity was so hegemonic, right? It was so dominant in the culture that there was a great pressure on people to at least pretend that they were nominally Christian, even if they weren't. So when you look at the census, for example, somebody would come to your door and ask you questions verbally, right? And usually it was someone from your neighborhood. So you had a lot of pressure to make sure that your answers were respectable, right? And so, but, going by the census, something like 95% of the population said they were one sort of Christian or another. And then, there was about 2% who were Jewish. And then a few, some tiny representatives of other religions and indigenous traditions, and self-professed atheists and agnostics and rationalists and secularists. There were a lot of different terms, or people who said they had no religion. That was like just a tiny, like 0.002% of the population, something like that. And that stays the same for quite a while until about 1951, when it ticks up a little bit, but then of course it's in the 60s when that really starts changing, and I think in 1971 it's like 70 or 7%, and then it starts going. Now the most recent census, I think about 1/3 of Canadians said they had no religion. So it's changed very drastically. So there's, I think Callum Brown, the sociologist, he argues that, like, he's done comparative studies of Western nations and the secularization process, and I think he argues in one of his books that Canada went from being like it had very high levels of religious affiliation in terms of number of people going to church, on a monthly or weekly basis, and all of these, like church memberships and all that, people saying they were religious in the census, and then that changes so rapidly in across Canada that it's probably the fastest transition in any of the Western nations that he's looked at. So it's a very interesting, yeah. So you're right, like so looking at Canada in the interwar period, it's so so different than what we imagine Canada as being like today.
Yeah, right. And it's stable during this time.
Yeah, right. There's not many challenges to the there are the groups that I talk about who are pushing back against religious dominance, but really they don't make that much of a dent. There's people talk about them a lot, or they carry out, or they hold a big space in popular imagination because they're so weird and dangerous in that way, right? But
yeah,
it's not like they have wide success either.
Yeah, because clearly not if it's that stable for that long. But there was variation throughout Canada, wasn't there, between the East Coast and the West Coast, and certainly, I mean, Quebec is a very different sort of animal, especially at that time. How are the regions different in the interwar period?
Well, yeah, so especially British Columbia. There's a few Canadian historians who have really focused in on BC as being an outlier, and this kind of actually holds true for the West Coast of the United States as well. But just limiting ourselves to Canada for now. BC had much higher rates of unbelief or religious indifference, whatever you want to call it, than the rest of Canada. Now those numbers were still very low, but it was still, I don't remember the exact numbers, but it was still something like 3 or 4% of the population as opposed to, 0.002, right?
Mm-hmm. Right. Yes.
Yeah. And even if a lot of people were nominally Christian, there was still a lot of hand-wringing going on among the clergy about how so many people in BC didn't go to church, right? So there's definitely a shift, or sort of, you can see that as you move further west. And I do get the impression that, looking at the stories in my book, Winnipeg is, a little more open to the rationalist organization that exists there, as opposed to we don't see the same big conflicts in Winnipeg as we see in the chapters on Toronto or Montreal. So there is a little more openness to unorthodox, let's say, ways of thinking.
Yeah. And who are the kinds of people who are atheists and agnostics and so on, and who want to attend these meetings? You've done some work on trying to get at the socioeconomic status of these kind of people and so on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we're really fortunate that the Winnipeg Rationalist Organization left behind a lot of papers and membership lists and that sort of thing. So I was able to use those. These organizations tend to sort of vanish, or they don't necessarily have institutional record that gets left behind, right? So this is good, pretty great opportunity to learn more about ordinary rank and file secularists and rationalists. Looking at the Winnipeg situation, it was very much a working class movement. Perhaps we could say that maybe the educated working class, or the more skilled laborers, were kind of the number one group represented there. In that context, it was very much a British membership. So I'd say about 75% were British, Scottish, or Irish. But there was a representation of other groups. So there was sort of secular Jewish people, Icelandic people who have that history of Unitarianism. And then a smattering of other, some Americans and some other Europeans. So predominantly white, definitely in that time period. And also there was between 30 and 40% of the membership were female, were women, which is pretty high for these sorts of.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Tended to be very male dominated. So yeah, it's an interesting, and that's, I don't have the same information about the groups I studied in Montreal or Toronto, but they were definitely working class, and very much in that autodidact tradition, that self-taught tradition of working people who read a lot of books, and they didn't none of them went to university. With the one outlier of a rationalist lecturer I talk about from British Columbia, who was a dentist, that he was the one with the highest education. But mostly these people were workers who had taught themselves, had read a lot of magazines and books, and taught themselves how to speak, and went on the lecture circuit.
I mean, that's kind of amazing because at the time, it's so, like you were saying, it's hegemonic. It's almost totally religious. It sounds almost monolithic when you get to numbers that are like 98, 99%. The way you describe it in the book as Christendom, which I've heard people kind of use this term before, but you described it much better than anyone else. Could you tell us, explain what you mean when you talk about Christendom, especially in the context of Canada at that time? What does it mean when we think about a place as being part of Christendom?
Well, I mean, that term has had different meanings over the years, but the situation or the context that I use it in comes from a sociologist of religion named Hugh MacLeod, who talks about Christendom as being that formal or informal arrangement of like a state being identified with Christianity and having idea that the state should defend and promote Christianity in its territory. And so, of course, this goes right back to Constantine, right? With taking over the Christianity, becoming first accepted and then eventually adopted as the official religion of the empire. But we see this in many different states over the next 1,500 years, right? And so in Canada, there wasn't an official state church, but on the one hand, but there also wasn't any separation of church and state as defined in the U.S. So what we really see in Canada is this kind of, this idea that the state should promote and defend the Protestant churches and the Roman Catholic Church. And there's this kind of uneasy truce between the Catholic Church, which dominates Quebec, and then the Protestant churches, which dominate the rest of the country. Although Catholicism is present throughout, but so that's why you see the cases that I talk about, the blasphemous libel cases, where people are tried for offending God and offending the Christian community and the Christian church. When J.S. Woodsworth, the socialist parliamentarian, tries to get the law of blasphemous libel repealed, he's really shouted down by the vast majority of the other politicians who believe still in that time period that Canada is a Christian nation and should defend Christianity.
Really? Now, was it just sort of the not in the water? Is it just sort of like the cultural norm, just the idea? Okay, we're a Christian nation, we need to defend it, or were there other sort of overt institutions like blasphemous libel law? I mean, that's just having that is kind of shocking, right? Like you have blasphemous libel law that's used, explicitly to defend Christianity. Were there other systems or other institutions that made it explicit and said, we are defending our laws that we get from Christianity. We are part of, we're part of the great chain from God, or was it more informal?
Well, the topics I kind of look at in my book is, of course, are the blasphemous libel law and the enforcement or the censorship of stuff that was considered blasphemous material, like reading material that was coming especially from outside. So the customs had the right to stop anything that they considered to be blasphemous from entering the country. And so that means that although it was applied quite haphazardly a lot of the time, but there are a lot of cases of them stopping atheist literature from coming into the country. And there was a lot of popular support for that, or usually how they would enforce that was that somebody from a religious or patriotic organization would say, "Oh, we got to stop this particular journal from coming into the country," and so then they would crack down again and ban it. But of course, there's much broader and deeper issues, which I'm sure, a lot of social and cultural historians have looked at the way that patriarchy and heterosexuality and all of these Christian values were definitely widely enforced by the school system, for example, right? And especially in that this gets more explicit in Quebec, of course, with the heavy predominance of the Catholic Church, but it's present in other other parts of Canada as well. And then I mentioned, for example, as late as the 1940s, we find this push to this fear of immorality among the younger generation. And so there was, these Bible lessons or these Christian lessons that were being put into schools in the 1940s, right? Because they wanted to crack down on juvenile delinquency or what have you, right? And there were people who, you know, protested, but widely, you know, these were widely implemented policies. So yeah, you know, there were many ways in which Christianity was backed by the state.
Yeah, it's kind of paradoxical maybe that like at this time, like the time you're talking about and earlier, I guess, like Canada was probably more religiously orthodox perhaps than the US was. And I mean, that could just be, well, there may be many reasons for that, but I mean, it's sort of shifted now, obviously, where I think Canada is much more non-religious than the US was. So it is quite an interesting case of how, you know, how there has been this shift. I mean, why do you think that is the case, that Canada was more religious at the time, but has now kind of gone in the opposite direction than the US?
You know, I'm a historian, not a sociologist, so it's
right. Yes.
scary to like, you know, try and
Yeah.
have an opinion on these matters. But, you know, I think there are certain theories. I mean, one is that there wasn't as much of a fundamentalist movement here in Canada, and most of the population was part of these large umbrella churches, right? And so the Catholic Church, the United Church, the Anglican Church. And so there's this sort of theory that if you're part of a large, like that secularization kind of happened through these larger structures. And so there was less like personal connection with the church. And so, you know, if the whole society started shifting, then, you know, if you were a member of one of these churches, you had less of a stake in a way, right? Or so that you kind of drifted with the larger society or the larger church, as opposed to the States where there was a lot more like tight-knit communities where people were really connected with their local church. So that's one theory. Yeah, it's a complicated issue. And you know, there was the influence of sort of the social gospel or more liberal Christianity in Canada. This sense of like, you know, because the country was divided between French and English and between Catholic and Protestant, there was a certain amount of like live and let live. I mean, you know, there was still a lot of hostility too, but there was this sense of like, okay, well, we need to sort of get along.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's interesting because we have this, you have kind of both like competing forms of Christianity that are both state supported in a way, and a very different kind of, it sounds like a very different form of Christianity, at least what I'm used to in the US, which is much more pluralistic and much more personalized and evangelical. That's the big strain these days. And now it makes me wonder, was the atheism different as well? I mean, at its core, atheism is only just like there is no God. But, you know, with secularization, there also comes to the point where like, well, actually, you know, a lot of what we're talking about is against the dominant religion. And we see in the US, it's much more liberal in terms of, oddly, things like immigration, but also things that make sense. Like you're more environmentalist, you're more pro-gay rights. What were the big strains of atheism like at that time in the interwar period?
What I found in my research was there was more of a connection between the political left and the secularist or rationalist tradition than perhaps in the UK or in the US, where there was a stronger, what we might call sort of liberal tradition of atheism or secularism. Not to say, you know, there definitely were left-wing and socialist and communist atheists in those other countries, but in Canada, I don't know, for whatever reason, there was a somewhat different trajectory. And so a big part of the book is me looking at how these different atheist or rationalist communities grappled with politics, especially, you know, in the suffering of the Great Depression and trying to come to terms with capitalism and so, you know, ideas of socialism, and trying to understand, okay, so, you know, let's say we've kicked God out of the universe, or we're living in this godless life, you know, like what does that mean for us politically or socially, right? And so there are a lot of overlaps between, you know, and maybe it's because the communities were smaller in some ways, so there was a lot more people talking to each other, you know, between socialist movements and secularist movements. And so most of the people that I look at were self-identified, you know, as being on the left to one degree or another. and that kind of shapes how some of these communities are first organized and then gradually fade away or ended because of political, like at least two of the people who I look at end up moving away from being so active in sort of secularist circles, and because they decide to put their energy into progressive political activism and running for office and that sort of thing instead, right? And so there's definitely more overlap in that regard.
Mm. And it seems like there's kind of a tension between between whether to emphasize heavily like kind of left-wing politics or whether to focus more on like the non-religious side, like kind of anti-religious kind of agitation. And it seems like, I don't know if you think this is right, but it seems like as the 1930s go on, like more and more of them are moving more toward like the kind of more political angle, like focusing more on socialism rather than kind of the anti-religious focus. Do you think that's right?
Yeah, definitely. I think that's the case. I quote, there's a British rationalist, I think Robert Arch was his name. I don't remember his exact name, but in the book where he talks about in the 1930s, there was also a movement among the rationalist movement in the UK and he says, we can keep repeating the biblical criticism and the promotion of evolution, but like people are suffering, right now. People want to know, like, well, what does this all mean for our life here and now, right? How should we live our lives? How should we organize society? And like, we need to become more political if we want to speak to people's interests. And so that's definitely a movement that I noticed in Canada as well. Like in Winnipeg, there was that movement where Marshall Gauvin, who was the leader of the rationalists in Winnipeg, becomes very pro-communist or very sympathetic to communism, as the sort of chaos of the Great Depression carries on, and he sees so many of his working class people suffering so much. In Toronto, there's this movement as the Rationalist Society there starts to get really involved with political speakers, and this is a lot more pluralistic, perhaps. There's, socialists and communists of different stripes that all get together and come and speak. And in Quebec, of course, the organization that I look at there was a lot more politically explicit from the get-go. But even there, we see some interesting things happening, like the formation of the Association Humanitaire, which is this kind of activist response that these atheists had to the Great Depression. And so there's this interesting thing that happens where we have them organizing the unemployed and like resisting evictions and things like that, at the same time that they're encouraging their members to write letters to the local bishop and renouncing their membership in the Catholic Church. You think, okay, like why is there this particular blending of atheist activism with social activism or socialist activism? And it makes sense when you realize how heavily the church was involved with delivering social services and running so much of civil society in Quebec. So like, it was part of their campaign to try and get secular government to take those things over, because often it was the local priest who was deciding who was getting relief funds, for example. So if you didn't show up for mass, you weren't getting your relief money, right? And so that was something that the local atheists and communists felt very strongly about. So, so you see this, blending of these two traditions or these two types of movement.
Mm. Yeah, I noticed, I think it was Gauvin who kind of reversed the Soviet argument about, the Soviets had taken the stance, well, we change the material conditions of the world. Once we create communism, religion will die away. And he kind of reversed it and said, well, once we make everybody atheist, then we'll get real communism. And I had never heard that argument before, and I thought that was astounding. And were these, like, how much of this is homegrown? How much of it is just like he's just developing it himself, or are they working with sort of established ideas already?
Well, they all had connections with movements outside of Canada. So Gauvin, he became a rationalist when he went to Boston to visit his relatives, and went to the Thomas Paine Memorial Hall, I think it was called. And somebody who went to his home later in life said he had big portraits in his home, one of Ingersoll and one of Charles Bradlaugh from the UK, right? So And similarly, the people in Toronto were connected with these larger traditions of secularism and rationalism from the UK and free thought from the United States. And Gauvin wrote for like the great Truth Seeker journal from which was the flagship of rationalism in the States. But they also were responding to local conditions, right, and trying to work with the communities that they were embedded in as well. And so I think that's partly why you see them trying to make political decisions based on the conditions on the ground, right? No one's 100. I mean, this is kind of like a larger historical argument about how, for example, historians used to think, well, all communists took orders straight from Moscow. And then, of course, when you dig into the realities, most people were, they were paying attention to Moscow, but they were also trying to make decisions based on the local conditions. And so similarly, secularists and rationalists in Canada were not all reading the Truth Seeker and doing what it said, right? They had their own local battles that they were trying to fight. And, for example, in Toronto, the struggles over free speech in the streets of Toronto, and the struggle to ally themselves with the local radical political organizing, that sort of thing. So they were definitely, pushing back against blasphemous libel in a way, that wasn't a problem in, say, somewhere else, right? So yeah, everybody, there was always a pull and push between the local and the international.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and one thing that kind of was interesting to me related to that is even though there were these international connections, like you mentioned that actually the various Canadian groups in these different cities, like they didn't actually have that much connection with each other, which is pretty interesting.
Yeah, they don't even seem to have been aware of each other. It's really, which
is really crazy.
Yeah, which really speaks to the reality of Canada in those days, and that it was an archipelago of these little communities, widely scattered across a huge landmass, right? And so most of them had more connection with the nearest Canadian or the nearest American city than they did with the other Canadian cities, because it was a lot easier to drive down to Minneapolis than it was to go to Toronto, for example, if you were in Winnipeg.
Wow, I hadn't considered that. That's wild. Okay, so I had a larger question about this, because one of the things that we've seen in the recent history is that with the advent of the internet and, the Four Horsemen publishing, we get an explosion of atheism that comes after it. And this is a time where people are really isolated, and there isn't much spreading at all. But they did try. How successful were things like the like debates and lecture series? Did they win converts? Were they popular? What was going on up there?
Yeah, it's interesting because, like I was saying, when you look at the things like the census, atheists seem like a very tiny minority, but there were a lot of people coming out to these debates, to these lectures. There was a very different culture in those days of public lecturing, that you could get 200 to 300 people on a bad day, and 500 to 800 people on a good day. It's just remarkable, and how you could get people to come and sit down and listen to you talk about whatever your topic was. And somebody like Gauvin, who was a really good speaker, could pull large crowds. And there's that incident that happens where he debates a local fundamentalist, and there's something like 3,000 people who come out to hear this debate, and it's spread out over 2 theaters, because there's so many who show up. So there, especially in the 1920s, I find out there was this sort of feeling of uncertainty around religion, and a certain kind of sarcastic atheism was a popular mental image for a lot of people, or it was kind of floating around. This is the Roaring '20s in the States. There's a certain kind of irreverence in the air. Now that maybe it may have been a bit less so in Canada, but there was a lot of people talking about the big clash between fundamentalists and modernists in the Scopes trial, for example, over the teaching of evolution. Those ideas were in the air, and people were talking about them, and that created an opening for atheists and agnostics and secularists to put forth this criticism of religion as a whole. Yeah, so it's I was going to mention the I spent a few pages looking at a lot of the memoirs and novels written by veterans of the First World War, and there's a great deal of skepticism and criticism of Christianity and of religion. they saw so much suffering and so much terror and horror in the Great War. And so many of these books are saying like, how could there be a good God if we saw so much suffering and chaos? Like it's impossible. Like we reject this idea. So whether, there are some people who say, well, they were, they didn't necessarily feel that way during the war. It was a different, the 1920s were a different time. But, for my purposes or the purposes of the book, that's, it doesn't really make much difference. There was this openness to these kind of skeptical ideas in that time period.
Yeah. And it seems like, even like, even as you mentioned that the actual numbers of people who claim to be atheists or non-religious, like, is really, really tiny, but it doesn't quite capture the picture that this is nonetheless a time where people are reading about this or going to lectures or debates about it and so on. I think you used the term like moral panic. I think that's right. Or maybe I just imagined that, but it seems like, at least in Toronto, that there's a ton of concern about that atheism is spreading. Even though the numbers are quite tiny by comparison.
Yeah, there was a great deal of there was a very bitter struggle that took place in Toronto between the old guard evangelical Protestant conservative elite who sort of ran that city and who had, there was this joke about, it wasn't a joke. They called it Toronto the Good, right? It was this very proper, respectable city in which, there was a great deal of controversy over whether they should let the streetcars run on Saturday or not, right? Or sorry, on Sunday or not, because it was the Lord's Day, right? And so there was this predominant and hegemonic control that Protestantism had over the city. And that really comes under attack in the late 1920s and early 1930s. And, traditionally historians have sort of focused on the anti-communist struggle that takes place. They call it the free speech struggle, whether communists were allowed to speak in the streets. But I found in my research that, in fact, the atheists and the rationalists were very much caught up in this as well. And there was a lot of pushback against them and their rights to speak publicly. And of course, there's the blasphemous libel case that happens with Ernest Sterry and his rationalist newspaper. And of course, there's moral panic around. There's a feisty young student who writes an editorial for the University of Toronto newspaper, in which he argues that most students are closet atheists or openly atheists. Of course, this evokes a huge amount of uproar among more conservative Torontonians. So it was one of those things where not very few people would necessarily go all the way and start attending rationalist lectures, but it was something that a great many people were talking about. And it's hard for historians to prove these sorts of influences, how can you show that somebody publishing a rationalist newspaper would later play a role in secularizing, the secularization process that took place in Canada. So it's difficult to make those connections, but I do think they played a key role in popularizing some of these ideas. And so even if not everybody joined up, these concepts were at least out there in the popular consciousness.
Yeah, it is tough to sort of stretch it from one thing to the other. But one of the points you brought up is like the autodidacticism, right? That people are informing themselves. One of the themes on this show that we found is that deconverting is very lonely. It's kind of isolating. You usually do it alone. Whereas you join a church, you join a group. I'm wondering if you can point to some of the speakers and some of the organizers that you talk about and do you know what their road was to becoming informed free thinkers and informed atheists? How did their conversion happen? How did their transformation happen?
Well, I mentioned Marshall Gauvin. He was raised in a household that was, his mother, I think, was Catholic and his father was a Baptist or vice versa. But he converted to Christianity at age 18 or 19. And then that same year, he went to visit his siblings who had moved down from New Brunswick to Boston. And they introduced him to freethought, and he just was totally blown away by that. He attended some lectures. He started reading Ingersoll, and he converted to freethought and eventually gave up his job as a carpenter to become a freethought lecturer. And so For people like him, Bert Levins in Ontario, William Stiles, I definitely get the impression that they read a lot. So reading things like The Truth Seeker, or reading different pamphlets or collections of lectures by Ingersoll, people like that. That's how many people connected with these ideas. But then, of course, when we see the rise of these rationalist groups in Toronto and Winnipeg, and to in a slightly different context, of course, in Quebec and Montreal, then we see the social aspect rising, right? And so then people get together, once a week or more than that, and sit down and listen to a lecture and debate, ask questions and discuss things that they've read or things that they've heard. And so that's then you get more of a nurtured community. So yeah, I think it was very lonely, and I think there was a weird kind of downturn in the fortunes. Like if you look at sort of the period that Nathan studied with the 19th century secularism, there is this sense that a generation dies off in the late 19th century and the early 20th century, and people like Ingersoll and Bradlaugh, they all die. And you read the journals from those, like the atheist journals from that time period. It's just like obituary after obituary. People are like, the end of the movement? Are we all going to die? And there was definitely a sense of that happening. However, I guess what I found with my research is that there was a revitalization of that tradition in the 1920s and 30s in Canada, right? So yeah, it's interesting. Like there's a generational aspect to these shifts, and like whether or not you'll have a community to to go and listen to hang out with like-minded atheists. That really depends on your time and place. But in certain times and places, yeah, you could like, I'm going to go listen to this freethought lecture, and the next thing you've become a freethinker, as opposed to I have to sit alone in my house and read issues of the Truth Seeker because there's someone else.
Yes. Yeah, and I actually kind of on that point, like, were they doing like Gauvin's society? Like, were they doing things like more communal sort of things, like aside from just these, giving lectures or having debates? Like, was there, this is a kind of a perennial issue, I'd say, for atheist groups, like, and even today, like, what exactly should we be doing when we get together? Like, and you can only listen to so many talks about like religion or science or whatever. But so I wonder, like, was there kind of a community building aspect in some way too, in addition to like just kind of giving lectures and so on?
Well, it varied from place to place. In Winnipeg, of course, Marshall Gauvin was making his living as a lecturer, right? So his lectures always, he almost never had any guest lecturers, and his lectures were always the central point of every meeting, because that's how he made a living. Whereas, but you do get little hints here and there of like social events that they had, like a sort of like a secular Christmas party for the kids. That's
interesting. Yeah.
Discussion groups that would get together outside of those regular lectures, outside of that regular lecture schedule. In Toronto, you get more of a sense of a community of social events, and a lot more variety. There was a great many people who were invited to come and speak, and that's where you start to see, there's like a Black freethinker, Lionel Cross, who speaks a number of times. There's some women who speak, so a little bit more diversity there. And I saw they would run ads for like, let's come and we'll have a social gathering and we'll have a dance or something like that. So there were attempts to foster a social life. And of course, in Montreal, they were really dealing with some of the poorest and, most downtrodden people in the city who were coming to these lectures. But there was they were encouraging them to learn how to speak publicly, take books from our local library and learn about science, or learn about, the crimes of the church. And like, we'll encourage you to give a lecture, and like, try to get people involved and educated, because they were so destitute. So there was definitely more of a social aspect in Montreal. But yeah, they struggled with that too, like this idea of like, okay, we can get 500 people out for a lecture because it's in a way that's popular entertainment. And there is a line that I quote from a British rationalist who says, unless you either went to chapel on Sunday evening, or you went to the pub and drank yourself silly, or you went to a broad law lecture. Like there was like it was one of the only alternatives to either religion or the hard drinking masculine culture. So it was in a way, it wasn't a form of entertainment and socialization.
Yeah. And kind of with that in mind, are there any kind of lessons you can draw from your research about like the state of, I don't know, the secular movement today? I don't know, like if there's any, wisdom from history or whatever that can be brought to the question. Yeah.
Well, as a fellow historian, you know how difficult it is to draw these connections. But yeah, I guess personally, if I had to describe myself, I'd say I'm a secular leftist as opposed to a left secularist. Like I feel leftism is my primary identity, and I happen to be a secular leftist, and that's so I can't necessarily speak to the secular movement, specifically, but I do think that at least the people that I was looking at, they found that ultimately they couldn't just there's a quote from somebody from an American who explained why he stopped going to Marshall Gomez lectures, and the guy said, well, it's like I don't feel the need to hear him kill God every Sunday, because I feel that he was over many years ago. Like, why he's dead? Like, let's stop killing him, And so there's a sense to which like purely atheistic endeavors have a limited shelf life, right? Because people want to talk about, okay, well, now what, right? I mean, like like the title of this podcast, right? Beyond atheism. Like what happens next? Like, how do we live our lives? Like, what does this mean for sexuality or for gender or for issues of economic inequality and that sort of thing? And we have problems today around inequality and suffering, especially in the Great Depression, right? So they wanted to hear about that. And so I think, that's maybe I don't know if it's a lesson, but it's something that I think atheist groups are going to, have encountered and will continue to encounter, is that there needs to be some sort of constructive message, and whether that's around humanism or it's around a certain political agenda, is unavoidable.
Mm-hmm. Oh, well, in that case, can I smuggle in a buzzword so we get a higher search optimization?
Sure.
Because there is a bit of like intersectionality in what they were doing, right? Because they're all part of either like socialist groups, communist groups, one big union, whatever it is. If we look at the other side of the coin, right? Like, it's say, okay, well, the atheism does have a shelf life. You can't, once you kill God, he's kind of dead, and after that, it gets boring. What happened to the other side? So like if there is this union of left-wing activism and atheist activism, and the atheism really doesn't go anywhere for 40 years, what happens to the left-wing activism during the interwar period and beyond? Did it take off as well?
Well, there's what I saw is that a lot of the people ended up in Canada. Like, it depends on your local political situation, right? So in Canada, the left really sort of ends up polarizing around either the Communist Party or the Commonwealth, the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, which is the forerunner of today's NDP. So at that time, it was sort of democratic socialists, and then during the Cold War in the 1940s and 50s, it gradually shifts to a more moderate social democracy. And so a lot of the people who I look at, they end up moving into the CCF/NDP and becoming more active in political, social, or progressive social democracy. And then, of course, a few others shift towards the Communist Party, but then, of course, the Cold War happens, right? And so atheism gets slandered as, the godless communist threat, right? And so it goes underground. And there's a big shift in the demographics around these groups, right? So I feel like that working class tradition that was so powerful that came out of the 19th century England and the US, and of course shows up in Canada as well, that starts to change. And so by the 1950s and 60s, the secular humanist groups that start growing, they are almost all professional, highly educated, like organized, highly educated people we don't see that working class community anymore. So there's a big social shift that happens, and sort of a lot of that political energy, like ends up running into sort of more moderate, but progressive social democracy movements, and into other causes, right? So people, in certain one time and place, they might have become a secularist, but then later on they end up becoming a early feminist, say, or start fighting for racial justice and that sort of thing. And so where people's energy goes kind of shifts as the society changes, as the political context changes. Although I should point out Lionel Cross. I think you sort of gestured towards him with your intersectionality, that we find Lionel Cross, who is a black freethinker in Toronto. We later find him fighting the KKK and fighting for a very early anti-racist alliance in Toronto or in Ontario, rather. So there were some of those connections happening back then as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, Elliot, I think you did it. I think you answered the question that this podcast was arranged around. What comes after atheism? Now we know that's what it is.
Mm-hmm.
Left-wing progressive movements. Well, that's fantastic. Are you ready for the lightning round, Elliot?
All right, let's do it. Yeah, I've always been fascinated by your the atheist round.
Yeah, Nathan, can you set it up for us in the audience?
Yes, it's called Can a True Atheist? It's about questions, can a true atheist do certain things or not? And it's somewhat tongue-in-cheek. And actually, Elliot, you mentioned you really identify more as an agnostic, and we can change it to can a true agnostic if you prefer.
Yeah, I think in most matters I'm probably practically an atheist, but I kind of, as you know, Nathan, having written a lot on this subject, atheism originated as an insult that religious people threw at each other. And so I feel like I like the word agnostic a bit less defined by religious people. Anyways, but yeah,
interesting.
Yeah, well, we can stick with agnostic for now.
Okay. So for the first question, can a true agnostic believe in God?
I don't think so. I think the whole point is, either you don't believe in God or you feel like that sort of knowledge isn't possible, or that it's an incoherent question. I think, I don't think you can.
Is that where you came down on it? That it's an incoherent question? That's a pretty, I think that's a unique answer for this question.
Depends on what day you ask me. I might change my opinion, but yeah, I think that is a position that I'm more attracted to, in that like some of these arguments are like philosophically just don't make sense, or it's a sort of knowledge that human beings can't have or aren't able to coherently think about. So, anyways, yeah.
Right. It's not even a question. We can expand this one, make it a little broader. Can a true agnostic wear crucifix jewelry or any sort of religious iconography or aesthetic?
I think they could. I mean, the position I kind of take is that like religion is a completely human-made product, and people can do all sorts of good or bad or weird things with those human-made products. And so if somebody wanted to, I don't know, there's that scene in True Detective season 1 where Matthew McConaughey is like staring at this crucifix every day, and his partner is like, "What? I thought you're an atheist. What are you looking at that for?" He's like, I believe in the crucifix because it talks about like sacrificing yourself and like giving up your, like ego death, and something like that.
Yeah.
People can give all sorts of meanings to these symbols, right? And it's not up to me to tell them they can't.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
Powerful.
Okay. Can a true agnostic commit a sin?
I would hope that a true agnostic would sort of evolve beyond the idea of sin. I think that is also kind of an incoherent concept in the context of atheism or agnosticism. But if they wanted to if they found that language useful, maybe they could repurpose it to whatever end they wanted. But yeah, so I guess so.
Okay.
Yeah. All right. So it sounds like you reject the idea of sin. How about blasphemy? Can a true agnostic blaspheme?
Can they blaspheme? Well, seems like a double-edged question. Like, I guess they could. Some people religious people could think that they are blaspheming, but yeah, whether the concept would have any purpose, would have any meaning to an agnostic, I don't think it would. Right? There's nothing. If it is a purely human creation, again, if somebody wanted to repurpose blasphemy in terms of, I remember talking to somebody and they were talking about how they went to this cancer fundraiser and there was these people sitting at the cancer fundraiser like chain smoking, and this person was struggling to find words for what that was.
Yeah.
It's meaning, like, yes, it was obscene, and so like that.
Yeah.
Maybe like dropping a nuclear bomb on a city could be considered a form of blasphemy against the human race or something. But I don't think it's a word that we necessarily need anymore. But if somebody wants to repurpose it, that's them.
Yeah.
I like that. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know if you follow American football, but Bill Belichick was recently fired, and I think a few people where I'm from originally thought it was an act of blasphemy. How about, can a true agnostic hate religious people? How about that?
True agnostic hate religious people? I think they could, yeah. I guess in that case, I would say, I would try and say, maybe take the position of a humanist and say that as a humanist, ultimately you shouldn't really be hating any human beings too much, or try not to, at least, whether or not you can or not. Whether or not you can actually achieve that, I don't know. But I guess you could hate them. Whether or not that's a good thing or a constructive way to be, that's another question. But it's certainly possible. And I think we've all been there sometimes.
Right.
Based on what you've written and the people you focused on, who all have the dalliances with the radical left, do you see that there's a natural connection between leftism and atheism?
I think atheism makes possible a certain kind of radical politics that maybe wasn't available before the development of atheism, in a way. Like I've been listening to this audiobook, this massive biography of Frederick Douglass, and just listening to the discussion of Frederick Douglass and the abolitionists, and how even at their most radical, most of them were still within a somewhat Christian or theistic framework in the way that they were thinking, right? And there were a few atheists among them as well, but then to see how over time, as those religious frameworks fall away, I think they do make possible a new kind of radical thought, and atheism does destabilize sacred structures of oppression in a way that, in a kind of a new way. So I think it does. I think there is a connection there for sure. Not to say that all atheists have to be leftists or all leftists have to be atheists, but right. I think there is a strong synergy, dare I say. Yeah.
I think that's right. Yeah, that it does. Like you say, at least it kind of opens the possibility for kind of reimagining the way we might want to construct society and so on.
Mm-hmm.
Moving to the next question on a totally different track. Can a true agnostic eat meat?
Oh boy. Yes, I used to be a vegetarian. I'm not anymore. I would hope that a agnostic would think through their relationship, or their status as a human animal, and start to sort of question or to think ethically about what's involved with eating meat, and perhaps start to think critically about those matters. But I don't think there's a hard and fast rule against eating meat necessarily.
Wow. And it comes up a lot. That's a surprising one. Can a true agnostic wish they believed in God?
Yeah, it's true agnostic. Yeah, I think they could. Yeah, sometimes there might be a little bit of yearning there, or a little bit of regret for certainties that they once had in the past. I think that's okay. I think it's a very human feeling sometimes to kind of be conflicted in one's beliefs. So I think that's acceptable. All right. Okay. And last but not least, can a true agnostic be a capitalist? Yeah. I think they can. Yeah, certainly. But as I said, I also think that there's a connection there between certainly between thinking critically about religion and metaphysics, and also thinking critically about the structures of society. And I think that, somebody who's only thinks skeptically about religion, but doesn't also start thinking skeptically about economics and society and race and gender and those sorts of things, then maybe they're not being skeptical enough, right? So I would hope that being agnostic would start making you think critically about those issues. But at the same time, you could be an agnostic and a capitalist.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right.
Elliot, this got surprisingly deep.
Yeah.
For something that started off so specific about the interwar period in Canada in 4 or 5 cities to end up here talking about unveiling the structures of oppression.
Well, that's the thing about history, right? Historians have to we have to work with the sources we have and the narratives we have, but then we hope that at the end of the day they can shed a little bit of light on these big issues.
Yeah. Well, you certainly
well said. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So the book is Towards a Godless Dominion: Unbelief in Interwar Canada. Elliot, is there anything else you'd like to plug?
Well, I'm currently working on it's still years for publication probably, but I'm looking, I've gone back to that earlier generation of rationalists. And so I'm looking through stuff from like the early 1900s, and trying to sort of write about or think about that, research that a bit. And also I got to say, the 1931 Canadian census has finally become available for keyword searching. So I'm going to have to revisit some of these interwar people and see what they said on their census answers, if they admitted to being a rationalist while they were going to rationalist meetings. I hope they did. But
right. That's fantastic. That's a fantastic follow-up project.
Yeah, keep an eye out for those follow-up projects. Yes. All right.
Yeah, thank you so much, Elliot.
All right, thank you.
Okay, that was Elliot Hanowski. That was a lot of fun talking with him.
Mm-hmm.
What did you take away from that?
It's kind of weird because I think like it's built around a period of time where basically nothing happens, and yet it's this fascinating story about what does happen. Like when you get into it, there's so much happening there. That's amazing. Because just the numbers, you think about what he's talking about. It's talking about a period of time where a country is overwhelmingly religious, at least nominally, right? Like on paper, it's in practice, you have this connection to the state, all this unbelievable stuff. Like it is a Christian country. And what are the atheists doing? What's this atheist population? And it's like at one point in the book, I don't think he brought up the exact numbers. I went and looked at them. He talked about how like it's different from the east to the west coast. It was like, he's like, it's a major difference. There's 10 times as many atheists in BC.
Yes.
And it's 1.6% of the population.
Right.
From 0.16 to 1.6. And it's a massive change.
Yeah.
So we're talking about a vanishingly small population. It's fantastic. I mean, that's shocking. And then you see like, it's kind of a story we've heard before, right? Like people go out and they talk about it and they spread their message, try to get other people to talk like them, and nothing happens. And that's kind of shocking. It's like, that's a big difference from what we've seen in the past 20 years.
Yeah. Or at least the seeds are maybe planted, even if you don't necessarily see the numbers right away.
It's possible.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things Elliot mentions is that it's a feeder into other things, which is part of what we're seeing today.
Right.
That we know that when the atheist community and non-religious people, when they become activists, they become highly politically activist. They become very motivated and very engaged. And it's not necessarily in atheist stuff. It's in, getting out the vote. It's in environmentalism. It's in LGBTQ activism. That's where we see most of it. So, and that's another story that where there's this very interesting overlap, right? We have this very different setting. One case where there's no atheism, but it's still related to this left-wing activism. Another case now where it's blossoming and it's also feeding into it. We see that those connections are the same. And he teased us with it, but we've got to find more about that. There's got to be something else out there.
Yeah. I think that was one interesting thing is just the overlap between, like political activism and non-religious activism. And it's hard to know, like, I think he sort of said something like he thinks of himself as like like a secular leftist rather than like a leftist secularist or whatever. And it's like,
yeah.
or whatever, or
Leftist first.
however he put it, like, but it's kind of like, which sort of identity and kind of activist label or whatever kind of takes prominence. And I think we see that kind of push and pull throughout the period he's looking at of people who, there's kind of this debate, like how much should we emphasize more of the politics or more of the non-religion? I think that's an issue today, obviously, as well, among some atheists or many atheists.
Yeah.
Doesn't
And
necessarily
one of
mean
the
you do
people,
both.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, ultimately, you're working on both at the same time. But
right.
One of the people he featured in the book, one of the chapters is devoted to Gavin in Winnipeg, the Rationalist Society, and we touched on it in the interview that like Gavin was flirting with the radical left and socialism and communism, but he reversed what the Soviets had argued, which is, the Soviets are arguing we get this, materialist conception of history. We take over, we make the world socialist, and then it becomes atheist. And Galvin reversed it and says, well, actually, if we make it atheist, then we'll naturally go to socialism, which is something we haven't really, that hasn't played out. It hasn't been tested, but it's an interesting perspective. And one I don't know that I think that's part of what we as atheists are promoting generally. Not in the socialist sense necessarily, but in the idea like, look, if you limit religion's power over society, if you lessen conditions of religious domination socially through the state and through broader social institutions, you get greater freedom. And I think is something we are absolutely committed to, and it's absolutely an atheist position. It's a positive statement that we're always bringing implicitly in just our existence, right? We're doing this because it's for greater freedom.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting, like the cause and effect. And I think it's, sometimes it's hard to tell, like, is it that things are getting better, therefore, like, there's just less of a need for religion, and like the state kind of does stuff that, providing healthcare, education, and charity, or like a sort of social safety net that kind of takes of religion. So as things get better, there's less of a need for religion, or is it that there's less of a need for religion, and then this allows things to get better? I mean, it's probably not like a straightforward kind of one way or the other. Is probably somewhat interlinked, but it is.
God, you just shot a huge hole in my thesis there, Nathan, because like this does come up too, like the idea of like if we reverse it, like, hey, like you get rid of religious domination, people stop going to church, right?
Yeah.
Which is maybe that's what's happening. And we kind of see this in a lot of what Elliot was talking about, how like, look, you have this interwar period that's relatively stable and things explode in the 50s and 60s. But some of the things that we see, those smaller battles that they talked about, free speech battles in Toronto, right? Which is it's not just socialism, it's religion, right? Like you need to be able to talk bad about religion, and the idea of like banning books, right? Like you need, like, why are these the targets? Why is the target of free speech left-wing activism? Why is the target of books people who are atheists and leftists?
Yeah.
That's not very surprising. Once you get that freedom, then you get it. And particularly because like what we're talking about is I think almost all of them, everyone featured in the book, everyone he talks about is like self-taught, right? Which I think is still how most people become atheists. Like you figure it out on your own. So there's definitely that idea, like more freedom leads to more atheists, but what we want is more freedom. So they go hand in hand. Maybe there's a cascading effect here.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, one funny thing, like, I mean, it's a difference between Canada and the U.S., where the U.S. has the the pretty clear like First Amendment, where I don't think we have something, or we didn't then, like something clearly in the Constitution about, freedom of speech and so on. And like it's sort of funny in this free speech battles, you would kind of see the conservative side saying like, yes, of course we believe in free speech, but like it needs to be done in an appropriate way and it can't be too provocative. And it's like, wait a second, like this
Yeah.
is not free speech at all then in that case. But
Yeah. Right.
yeah.
As long as you're not saying anything.
Yeah, exactly. And like, and also the way in which like this is another difference like with the US, where the courts and like the judges and stuff explicitly said like our job is to defend Christianity. That's like because we're a Christian state and like and so on. Whereas yes, obviously like also in the US like religion and had a lot of power, but there was at least that pretty clear constitutional barrier
Yeah.
or whatever. So yeah, it's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. Although, I mean, it's one of the dangers is that is kind of that view is being promoted now in the US. It's
Yeah,
never
oh
really
definitely.
gone away, but it's
No,
not
no.
true.
I mean, at least like in the US, there is always like, the Constitution to point to. And even though people find ways around it, talking about, I mean, in the 19th century, it was like talking about like obscenity or something like that as a way around like kind of free speech stuff. But yeah.
Yeah, we've come a long way, baby, I guess.
Yeah.
So yeah, Canada. I didn't know you guys you guys were that tight with religion.
Yeah. It's yeah, it is funny. I mean, given that, Canada's much more secular now.
Yeah.
But I think it's a good point, like you raised about like, having there's no formal state church in Canada, but like having kind of the Anglican Church and the Catholicism, like these maybe are somewhat like moderating influences. I don't know. I
Yeah.
mean, it's an interesting theory. It's the same with like the
Yeah.
UK or whatever, which is also
Yeah,
more secular now. So yeah, it's an
that's a
interesting,
good, yeah, right.
interesting idea. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, because there weren't as many. And
Hmm.
yeah, it's kind of you're only dealing with one. But the flip side of that, and this is, I think, yeah, this is kind of the last point I'll make on this one is when you are confronted with, oh, we're a Christian nation, this idea, oh, all
Hmm.
of our laws are derived from Christianity. Oh, like
Yeah.
everything, we are the lineage of Christianity and we need to protect it
Hmm.
going back to medieval time. That idea of, well, which Christianity are we? Because as he
Mm.
pointed out, even in Canada, which is overt at that point, it's explicit. You've got God in your constitution. Or did you even have a constitution back then?
Yeah, it was the like it was the called like the British North America Act, which created Canada. I mean, it was like a British document. I am not sure if God appears in that, but it does appear in our current constitution, which is a whole nother issue. But yeah.
When was that ratified?
The new one or the
Yeah, the new one.
it was in 1981, I believe.
1981?
Yeah.
How old is Canada?
I
Like
mean, like
40 years old?
formally, no, like we were created in 1867, but this new constitution was meant to like, well, before it was, it was a process of like gradually becoming independent from Britain, and there was still things that were, tied up not having our own constitutions.
1867.
Yeah.
We had already fought a civil war by then.
I know, right? I
What's
know.
going on up there? Okay, anyway,
Yeah.
the point
Yeah.
being, like which we have one where you guys you're putting yourselves in this realm of Christendom, but which
Yeah.
Christianity are you part of? Right? That it can be very, very distinct. They're not all the same, that you're following this lineage that's set by these rules of an alien institution that's being directed upon you. It's not this mythical heritage that's floating out there in the ether. It's part of a set of rules created by an institution you have no control over. So yeah, I mean, this is the thing. It sounds like this is the problem we've just proven over 20 minutes is that like you start with something where, well, I looked at 20 years where nothing happened, and you get this very, very rich body of work where you can keep finding more and more things in it.
Yeah. I think it's too strong to say nothing happened. I mean, there's a lot of like political battles and stuff going on. I think it's true. We don't see like, a dramatic decrease in religiosity from like the start of the 20s till the end of the 30s, but it's true that there's not that dramatic decrease, but I think there's still a lot of activism and advocacy and kind of court battles and stuff happening. So yeah, don't want to undersell the period. Still pretty interesting anyway, what's happening.
Yes, absolutely. We found it very interesting.
Yeah, we did. Yeah.
Anything else you took away from it?
There was a lot of interesting stuff, and just good historical work of like kind of doing details about tracking down like the membership lists and then pairing these with the census data to figure out like what kind of people are actually going in terms of like their ancestry and their jobs and their gender and stuff like this. So it's pretty interesting stuff. And
that follow-up's gonna be super interesting. So Elliot's doing interesting work, and I can't wait to hear more about it.
And it's only historians get excited about like when census data becomes available or whatever, but
it's searchable now.
But so the book is called Towards a Godless Dominion, Unbelief in Interwar Canada. So people should definitely check that out.
Yeah. Like, subscribe, smash those buttons. Send your complaints to nath.g. Is that on the
Nath G Alexander on Twitter?
Right? On X?
Yeah, on X. Yeah.
Yep.
Yep.
Yeah. There we go.